A millionaire cruelly abandoned his beloved. 25 years later, he froze upon seeing her with a young man identical to him at an airport. He approached. The summer air in Washington, D.C. was thick and oppressive, clinging to the skin like a second layer of clothing. Union Station was alive with activity, people bustling to catch trains, dragging luggage across the marble floors, and exchanging quick goodbyes before rushing off amid the chaos. Emily Carter stood still, her world crumbling around her. She clutched a battered suitcase with trembling hands, her knuckles turning white against the worn leather handle. Her brown eyes, usually so full of warmth and hope, brimmed with tears that threatened to spill at any moment. Across from her stood Michael Johnson, the man she had loved so deeply, now a stranger in a tailored suit. "I can't do this," Michael said, his voice low but unyielding. Emily stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "You can't do this. What are you saying, Michael? This is your child." He flinched as if the word child were a slap, but quickly composed himself. His gaze darted to the floor, avoiding the raw emotion in Emily's eyes. "Emily, you don't understand. My family, my future. I can't let this ruin everything I've worked for. My internship in London is set. My father's connections are finally paying off. I can't afford distractions." Emily's voice cracked as she stepped closer to him. "A distraction? Is that what we are to you?" "What I am, Michael. We built this life together. You told me you loved me. Was that a lie?" His jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "It wasn't a lie. But things are different now. We're different. My parents—" "Your parents," she interrupted, her tone dripping with anger and disbelief. "Since when do they control your life? Or mine?" Michael let out a frustrated sigh, finally meeting her gaze. For a fleeting moment, there was something human in his expression. Regret, maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You knew this wasn't part of the plan, Emily. I told you from the beginning that my career came first." Emily's heart sank. The man standing before her bore little resemblance to the Michael she thought she knew. She had believed in his dreams, supported his ambitions, and now she was being cast aside like an afterthought. "You're asking me to choose between my child and you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How can you be so cold?" Michael took a step back, putting physical distance between them. His voice was steady, almost detached. "I'm not asking you to choose. I've already made my decision. I'm leaving for London next month. You can handle this however you see fit." The finality in his tone struck Emily like a physical blow. Her legs felt weak, and she stumbled slightly, catching herself on the edge of her suitcase. Around them, the world moved on. Commuters brushed past, announcements echoed through the station, and the scent of coffee wafted from a nearby kiosk. But for Emily, time had stopped. "Michael," she called out, her voice breaking. "Don't do this, please." But he didn't look back. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his figure quickly swallowed by the crowd. For a moment, Emily stood frozen, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. She felt an overwhelming wave of grief, but beneath it was something else. Anger. Anger at Michael for abandoning her, anger at herself for trusting him, and anger at the world for allowing this to happen. With trembling hands, she wiped her tears and straightened her shoulders. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not when she had someone else to think about. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the ticket counter. The clerk barely glanced at her as she whispered, "One way to Atlanta, please." The man behind the counter hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to her tear-streaked face. But he said nothing. Simply sliding the ticket across the counter, Emily took it and turned toward the platform, her steps heavy but resolute. As she boarded the train, she found a window seat and sank into it, clutching her suitcase like a lifeline. Outside, the station's grand architecture loomed, a symbol of the life she was leaving behind. The train jerked to life, and slowly, the city she had called home began to fade into the distance. Emily stared out the window, her reflection faint against the backdrop of passing scenery. She rested a hand on her stomach, a gesture both protective and determined. "We'll be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to the life growing inside her. "I'll make sure of it." The hum of the train filled the silence, a rhythmic reminder that she was moving forward, away from the betrayal, away from Michael, and toward an uncertain future. For the first time in hours, a small flicker of hope ignited within her. She didn't know what awaited her in Atlanta, but she knew she couldn't stay in D.C., surrounded by the ghosts of what could have been. "This isn't the end," she murmured, her voice steady now. "It's just the beginning." As the train sped through the countryside, Emily allowed herself a moment to close her eyes. She didn't have a plan yet, but she had resolve, and sometimes that was enough to start over. The train ride to Atlanta felt both endless and fleeting. Emily Carter sat by the window, watching the scenery blur past, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels offered a strange comfort, a steady beat beneath the chaos of her thoughts. She had no idea what awaited her in Atlanta, only that it was far enough from Washington, D.C., to leave the pain behind, or at least try. When the train finally pulled into the station, the late afternoon sun bathed Atlanta in a golden glow. Emily stepped onto the platform, clutching her suitcase tightly. Around her, life bustled in a way that was both familiar and foreign. Families reuniting, couples holding hands, and street performers playing upbeat tunes. For a moment, she felt like an outsider looking in, disconnected from the vibrant energy of the city. Her first challenge was finding a place to stay, with limited savings and no immediate job prospects. Emily couldn't afford anything fancy. She found a modest boarding house on the edge of the city, run by a kind older woman named Mrs. Hensley. The house was small but clean, with creaky wooden floors and the faint smell of lavender lingering in the air. "You're a brave young woman, coming here all on your own," Mrs. Hensley remarked as she handed Emily a key. Her southern drawl was warm and soothing, a stark contrast to the cold indifference Emily had faced recently. "Thank you," Emily replied, her voice soft but steady. She didn't feel brave, but she appreciated the kindness. It was a small comfort in a world that had felt overwhelmingly cruel, settling into her room. Emily allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her still flat stomach, and let the tears flow freely. The weight of her situation pressed down on her, but she knew she couldn't wallow in despair for long. There was no time for self-pity. She had a baby to think about. The next few weeks were a blur of small but significant steps. Emily scoured the city for job opportunities, walking miles under the relentless Georgia sun. She faced rejection after rejection, each one a blow to her confidence. But just when she was about to lose hope, she stumbled upon a small school looking for a substitute teacher. The interview was nerve-wracking. Emily sat across from the principal, a stern but fair woman named Mrs. Coleman, who reviewed her credentials with an unreadable expression. Emily had always loved teaching and had completed her degree before her life took its unexpected turn. Still, she worried her lack of experience would count against her. "You're overqualified for this position," Mrs. Coleman said, finally breaking the silence. "Why are you applying for a substitute role?" Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm new to the city and trying to establish myself. I thought this would be a good way to start." Mrs. Coleman studied her for a moment longer before nodding. "You seem determined. I'll give you a chance." Emily left the school that day with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few months, she threw herself into her work. Taking every opportunity to prove herself, she quickly became a favorite among the students, her kindness and patience earning their trust. Teaching gave her a sense of stability and pride, a reminder that she was capable of building something meaningful on her own. As her pregnancy progressed, Emily faced new challenges. The mornings were often rough, with waves of nausea that left her drained before the day had even begun. She tried to hide her condition at first, fearing judgment or pity, but it became impossible as her belly grew. To her surprise, the staff and students at the school were supportive. Mrs. Coleman even adjusted Emily's schedule to make things easier for her. In her free time, Emily began preparing for the arrival of her baby. Her room at the boarding house was small, but she made the most of it, setting up a makeshift nursery in the corner. Mrs. Hensley, ever the motherly figure, offered her old crib and a stack of baby clothes. The kindness of strangers continued to astound Emily, reminding her that she wasn't entirely alone. Despite the progress she was making, nights were the hardest. Lying awake in the quiet darkness, Emily often found herself thinking about Michael. She hated how his memory lingered. an unwelcome ghost in her new life. She wondered if he ever thought about her, or the child he had so easily dismissed. But those thoughts only fueled her determination to prove she didn't need him. She would build a life for herself and her baby, no matter how hard it got, by the time her due date approached. Emily had carved out a small but stable life in Atlanta. She had a job she loved, a modest but cozy home, and a growing network of people who cared about her. Most importantly, she had hope, a fragile but persistent belief that things would get better. On a crisp autumn morning, as the first leaves began to fall, Emily welcomed her son into the world. She named him Ethan, a name that meant strong and enduring. Holding him for the first time, she felt a surge of love so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "You're my everything now," she whispered, cradling him close. "And I promise I'll give you the life you deserve." In that moment, Emily realized she wasn't just rebuilding her life, she was building a future. And while the road ahead was uncertain, she knew she had the strength to face whatever came her way. The sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the curb of a towering glass building in downtown Chicago. Michael Johnson stepped out. Adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit as the driver opened the door for him, he nodded in acknowledgement, a practiced motion that lacked genuine warmth, and strode into the building where his name gleamed in polished steel on the lobby wall. Johnson Global Investments. The air inside was cool, sterile, and efficient. Much like Michael himself, his assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Laura, greeted him with a schedule already prepared. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson. Your meeting with the board is at 10, lunch with Mr. Langston at noon, and you're scheduled for a charity gala at 7 this evening." Michael gave her a curt nod, barely registering her words. His days were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and appearances, each one blending into the next. It was the life he had worked so hard to build, the one his family had always envisioned for him. But as he stepped into the elevator, surrounded by reflective glass, he caught a glimpse of his own face, stoic, yet undeniably weary. The truth was, success had a price, and for Michael, that price had been steep. In his early years, Michael had thrown himself into his career with relentless determination. He had climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone expected, earning accolades and amassing wealth that most could only dream of. But somewhere along the way, the victories began to feel hollow. The more he achieved, the less it seemed to matter. He didn't allow himself to dwell on the reasons why, at least not often. Memories of Emily Carter and the choice he made at Union Station decades ago were locked away in a corner of his mind, one he rarely visited. And yet, there were moments, quiet, unguarded moments, when the past would resurface. Late at night, in the silence of his penthouse apartment, Michael would pour himself a glass of scotch and stare out at the glittering skyline. The city below was alive with energy, but all he felt was emptiness. He had no one to share his successes with, no family to come home to. While his colleagues spoke proudly of their children or their spouses, Michael remained tight-lipped, deflecting questions about his personal life. "You're married to your work," one of his partners had joked once, clapping him on the back. Michael had laughed along, but the comment lingered. Was this all there was? On rare occasions, Michael allowed himself to wonder what might have been. What if he had stayed? What if he had chosen Emily and the baby over his career? But those thoughts were quickly silenced by the voice of reason, or perhaps fear. "You did what you had to do," he told himself. "You made the right choice for your future." And yet, the ache remained. One particularly restless evening, Michael found himself digging through an old box of photos he had kept tucked away in his closet. Most of the pictures were from his college days, carefree moments with friends, graduation celebrations, and his early days in New York. But near the bottom of the box, he found a photo of Emily. She was laughing, her eyes crinkling at the corners, her hair catching the sunlight. He couldn't remember who had taken the picture or when, but seeing her face brought a flood of emotions he wasn't prepared for. He traced his thumb over her image, a pang of regret twisting in his chest. Michael quickly shoved the photo back into the box and closed it. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. There was no point in revisiting what couldn't be changed, but the regret was harder to ignore these days. As Michael approached his late 40s, he began to feel the weight of his choices more acutely. His parents, once so domineering in his life, had grown old and frail. His father's influence had waned, and the expectations that had once seemed so important now felt trivial. Michael often found himself surrounded by people, colleagues, clients, acquaintances, but he had never felt more alone. He had dated over the years, of course, but none of the relationships lasted. There was always something missing, something he couldn't quite articulate. At times, he wondered if he was being punished. He had abandoned Emily and their child without a second thought, prioritizing his ambitions over their lives. And while he had achieved everything he set out to, it often felt as though he had lost something far more valuable in the process. During a dinner with a longtime client, Michael found himself distracted, barely listening to the conversation. His thoughts drifted to the child he had never known. Was it a boy or a girl? How old would they be now? Did they look like him? Michael! The client's voice snapped him back to the present. You seem miles away. Everything all right? Of course, Michael replied smoothly, forcing a smile, just thinking about the next quarter. But even as he said the words, he knew they were a lie. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, Michael stared at the city lights and allowed himself to wonder, truly wonder, for the first time in years, what had happened to Emily? Where was she now? And was there any chance, however small, to make things right? He pushed the thought aside, finishing the last sip of his scotch. Tomorrow would be another busy day, another round of meetings and deals to distract him. But for the first time, the distractions weren't enough to quiet the voice in his head that whispered, "You made a mistake." The Atlanta sun filtered through the classroom windows, casting warm streaks of light across the desks. Ethan Carter stood at the front of the room, his voice steady and confident as he presented his latest project to a captivated audience of peers and professors. At 25 years old, Ethan exuded a quiet charisma that drew people in without effort. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, and his hazel eyes, so much like his mother's, sparkled with determination. And that's why improving urban education systems isn't just a challenge, it's a responsibility, Ethan concluded, his tone firm but passionate. A ripple of applause filled the room as he stepped back. His professor nodding in approval, Emily Carter sat in the audience, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched her son command the room. He had grown into a man she could scarcely believe she had raised on her own. Every long night, every sacrifice, every tear shed in silence had led to this moment. Ethan was her greatest achievement. After the presentation, Ethan approached her with his signature grin, the one that never failed to lift her spirits. "What did you think, Mom? I think you just convinced half the room to run for school board," Emily teased, pulling him into a hug. "You were incredible," he chuckled, his arms wrapping around her briefly before stepping back. "Well, I had a pretty great teacher growing up." Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. "You've always been the teacher, Ethan. I just gave you a head start." Their bond was unshakable, forged through years of shared struggles and triumphs. Ethan had never known his father, and Emily had been careful to keep it that way. From a young age, she told him that his father had passed away before he was born, a lie she justified as a way to protect him from the pain of rejection. It wasn't easy, carrying that burden alone, but Emily believed it was the best choice for both of them. Ethan had grown up with a strong sense of purpose, instilled by Emily's relentless determination to provide him with the life he deserved. She had taught him to value hard work, kindness, and integrity, qualities that shone through in everything he did. Now, as a graduate student pursuing a degree in public policy, Ethan was on the cusp of making a real difference in the world. Later that evening, as they sat together in their cozy apartment, Ethan shared exciting news. "I got the invitation to speak at the conference in New York," he said, his voice tinged with both excitement and nervousness. Emily's eyes widened. "Ethan, that's amazing, they chose you." "Yeah," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "It's a pretty big deal, Mom. Some of the top minds in education reform will be there." She reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "You've earned this, Ethan. They're lucky to have you." Ethan smiled, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "I just hope I don't screw it up." "You won't," Emily said firmly. "You never do." As the days passed and the trip to New York drew closer, Emily couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. She was thrilled for Ethan, of course, but the idea of returning to a city so close to Washington, D.C., stirred memories she had long buried. It had been over 2 decades since she left that part of her life behind, and she had no intention of revisiting it. But Ethan was her priority. If accompanying him to the conference meant confronting her past, she would do it without hesitation. The morning of their departure arrived quickly. Ethan was dressed sharply in a navy blazer and slacks, looking every bit the professional he aspired to be. Emily, ever supportive, wore a simple but elegant dress that complemented her warm features. As they boarded the plane, she couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would be significant in ways neither of them could foresee. The flight was uneventful, filled with polite conversation and Ethan's last-minute review of his presentation. Emily watched him with a mixture of awe and gratitude, marveling at the man he had become. She often wondered if his father would have been proud of him, despite everything. She hoped he would. When they landed in New York, the city greeted them with its usual chaos: honking taxis, hurried pedestrians, and towering skyscrapers that seemed to touch the clouds. Ethan was eager to explore, but Emily suggested they settle in at the hotel first. They had a few days before the conference, and she wanted him to be well rested for his big moment. That evening, as they dined at a small Italian restaurant near their hotel, Ethan shared more of his thoughts about the future. "You know, Mom, sometimes I think about where I get it from. This drive to make things better. I mean, I know it's you, but I don't know. I feel like there's something more." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She forced a smile and shrugged. "You've always had a strong sense of purpose, Ethan. That's just who you are." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer, but the weight of her secret pressed heavily on her. For years, she had convinced herself that shielding Ethan from the truth about his father was the right choice. But now, as she looked at the man he had become, she couldn't help but wonder if he deserved to know the whole story. Pushing those thoughts aside, Emily focused on the moment. This trip was about Ethan and his achievements, not her past. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as she always had, with strength and unwavering love for her son. The terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport buzzed with the familiar chaos of travelers rushing to catch flights, suitcases rolling across the polished floors, and announcements echoing over the intercom. Ethan Carter moved through the crowd with ease, his carry-on slung over his shoulder, and a confident stride that seemed to part the sea of hurried passengers. Emily followed close behind, her steps a little slower as she took in the energy of the city around her. "Gate 32, Ethan said, glancing back at her with a grin. "We've got plenty of time. You okay?" "I'm fine," Emily replied, adjusting her scarf. "Just soaking it all in. It's been a while since I've traveled anywhere this busy." Ethan chuckled. "Well, you're in New York now. Everything's busy." The city's energy seemed to mirror Ethan's enthusiasm for the trip. The conference was just a day away, and Emily could tell he was eager to make his mark. As they reached their gate, Ethan excused himself to grab a coffee, leaving Emily to find a seat near the large windows overlooking the runway. She settled into a chair and gazed out at the planes taking off, her mind wandering to the years that had brought her to this moment. Watching Ethan navigate life with such confidence and determination filled her with pride, but it also stirred memories she preferred to keep buried, memories of another airport, another man, and a life she had left behind, unbeknownst to her. Across the terminal, Michael Johnson stood frozen in place. He had just arrived at Gate 34, heading to a business meeting in London, when his eyes fell on a figure that made his breath catch. Emily. She was older now, her features more refined but unmistakably familiar. She sat by the window, her posture calm, her gaze distant, and then he saw him. The young man walking back toward her carried himself with an air of confidence that Michael couldn't ignore. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, the way he moved, the sharpness in his features. It was like staring into a mirror from decades past. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a freight train. That was his son. It had to be. The shock rooted him to the spot, and for a moment, he felt the weight of every decision he had made crashing down around him. The years of denial, the carefully constructed walls of his life, all crumbled in an instant, driven by something he couldn't quite name: guilt, curiosity, desperation. Michael took a hesitant step forward. He moved closer, weaving through the crowd until he was standing just a few feet away. His presence went unnoticed by Emily, who was now chatting casually with Ethan. Michael cleared his throat, his voice barely audible over the noise of the terminal. Emily. The sound of her name made her freeze. Slowly, she turned, her expression shifting from casual curiosity to something far more complex. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she took him in, his face older, lined with age and stress, but still unmistakably Michael. "Michael," she said, her voice flat, almost emotionless. "What are you doing here?" I'm on my way to London," he stammered, his usual composure nowhere to be found. I didn't know you'd be here." Ethan, sensing the tension, glanced between them. "Mom, who's this?" Emily's jaw tightened as she turned to her son. "Ethan, this is Michael Johnson. He's an old acquaintance." Michael flinched at the word acquaintance, but he couldn't bring himself to correct her. Ethan extended a hand politely, though his confusion was evident. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Johnson." Michael shook his hand, the contact sending a jolt of emotion through him. "It's nice to meet you too." For a moment, the three of them stood in an awkward silence, the bustling airport fading into the background. Emily's mind raced as she tried to process the situation. Of all the places in the world, of all the moments in time, Michael had to appear here, now, when she was least prepared to face him. Finally, she broke the silence. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Michael nodded quickly. "Of course." Ethan frowned. "What's going on, Mom?" Emily placed a hand on his arm, her voice steady but firm. "Just give us a few minutes, Ethan, please." Reluctantly, Ethan agreed, watching as his mother and this stranger, who seemed far too interested in him for comfort, walked away. They found an empty corner of the terminal, away from the crowd, and turned to face each other. "You've got some nerve." "Michael," Emily said, her voice low and sharp. "After all these years, you just show up like this." "I didn't plan this, Emily," he replied, his tone defensive but tinged with regret. "I didn't even know you'd be here." "That much is obvious," she shot back. "But now that you're here, what do you want?" Michael hesitated, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I saw you and him, Emily. Is he—" "Yes," she interrupted, her eyes blazing. "He's your son, but you don't get to act surprised, Michael. You made your choice a long time ago." Her words cut through him like a knife. "I know I did," he said softly. "And I've regretted it every day since." Emily's anger faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of something else. Pain, maybe, or exhaustion. "Regret doesn't change anything. You left us. I raised Ethan on my own, and he's turned out just fine without you." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "I'm not here to take anything away from you. I want to know him if he'll let me." Emily stared at him, her emotions warring within her. She had spent years protecting Ethan from the pain of knowing the truth about his father, and now, in an airport terminal of all places, that carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady but cold. "But don't get your hopes up, Michael. You've already done enough damage." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing alone, watching as she disappeared back into the crowd. Emily returned to Ethan, her heart racing and her thoughts tangled in a web of emotions. She had barely managed to keep her composure during her conversation with Michael, but now she had to face the inevitable questions from her son. Ethan stood by the gate, his brow furrowed as he watched her approach. "Mom?" he began cautiously. "What's going on? Who was that guy?" Emily hesitated, feeling the weight of years of secrecy pressing down on her. She had spent Ethan's entire life shielding him from the truth about his father. But now, standing in the middle of a crowded airport with Michael just steps away, she realized she couldn't hide it any longer. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. "There's something I need to tell you. Let's sit down." They found a quiet corner of the terminal, away from the noise and distractions. Emily took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Ethan watched her intently. The concern in his eyes only made it harder to begin. "The man you just met," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "is Michael Johnson. He's your father." Ethan blinked, the words hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. For a moment he said nothing, as if his mind was struggling to process what he had just heard. "My father," he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. I thought he died before I was born." Emily winced, the guilt she had carried for years rising to the surface. "I told you that because I thought it was the best way to protect you. The truth is, Michael and I were together a long time ago, but when I told him I was pregnant with you, he walked away." Ethan's expression shifted, a mixture of shock and anger flashing across his face. "He walked away, just like that." Emily nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Yes, he was young, scared, and under a lot of pressure from his family. But that doesn't excuse what he did. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you weren't enough. So I decided it was better to let you believe he wasn't around anymore." Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he processed the revelation. "So, all this time, he's been out there, living his life, while you raised me on your own." "Yes," Emily said, her voice breaking, "and I don't regret a single moment of it. You've been my entire world, Ethan. But I understand if you feel angry or confused. I never wanted to hurt you." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He had grown up idolizing his mother, watching her work tirelessly to provide for him and instill the values that had shaped his life. To learn now that his father had willingly abandoned them felt like a betrayal, not just by Michael, but by the story he had always believed about his own life. "I need some time to think," he said finally, his tone more measured, but still strained. "This is a lot to take in." Emily nodded, understanding completely. "Of course, take all the time you need. Just know that I'm here if you want to talk." As they sat in silence, Michael lingered nearby, watching from a distance. He had resisted the urge to follow them, respecting Emily's obvious desire to handle the situation privately, but the guilt and longing he felt were almost unbearable. Seeing Ethan, his son, up close for the first time, had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. Eventually, Ethan rose from his seat. "I need to stretch my legs," he said, his voice distant. "I'll be back in a bit." Emily watched him walk away, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and hope. She wanted desperately to believe that this revelation wouldn't change their bond, but she couldn't ignore the uncertainty that now loomed between them. As Ethan wandered through the terminal, he found himself gravitating toward the man who had just turned his world upside down. Michael was standing by the windows, staring out at the planes on the runway. For a moment, Ethan considered turning back, but curiosity, and a growing need for answers, propelled him forward. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice startlingly steady. Michael turned, his face lighting up with equal parts surprise and apprehension. "Ethan." There was an awkward pause as they sized each other up. Ethan's sharp gaze mirrored Michael's own, and the resemblance was impossible to ignore. "So," Ethan began, crossing his arms. "You're my father." Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yes, I am." Ethan tilted his head, his tone cool but not hostile. "Why now after all these years? Why show up out of nowhere?" Michael hesitated, searching for the right words. "I didn't plan this, Ethan. I didn't even know you existed until today. But the moment I saw you, I knew, and I can't explain it, but I had to talk to you." Ethan studied him, his expression unreadable. "You didn't know I existed?" Michael shook his head, guilt washing over him. "Your mother told me she was pregnant, but I was a coward. I told myself I couldn't handle it, that I wasn't ready to be a father, so I left. And it's the biggest regret of my life." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Michael took a deep breath and continued. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know if I deserve the chance to get to know you, but I'd like to try, if you'll let me." Ethan remained silent for a moment, his thoughts swirling. Finally, he spoke, his tone firm but measured. "I don't know what I want yet, but if my mom is okay with it, I guess we'll see." Michael nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Thank you, Ethan. That's more than I deserve." As Ethan walked away, his mind was a storm of emotions. He wasn't ready to make sense of it all, but one thing was certain. His life would never be the same again. The hotel room was unusually quiet. Emily sat at the small desk by the window, staring out at the glittering city lights of New York. Ethan was in the adjoining room, silent since their conversation earlier at the airport. She hadn't pressed him for more, knowing he needed time to process. but the weight of what had transpired pressed heavily on her. She traced her fingers along the edge of the desk, her mind replaying the encounter with Michael. His voice, his face, even his hesitant demeanor had stirred emotions she thought she had buried long ago. The anger, the betrayal. It was all still there, simmering just beneath the surface. Yet there was something else. Too, something she didn't want to name. Her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was a text from Ethan, taking a walk. "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." Emily exhaled a slow breath, relieved that he was at least communicating with her. She replied with a simple, "Be safe." As the message sent, her thoughts drifted back to the years she had spent shielding Ethan from the truth. She had always believed she was doing the right thing, but now, faced with the reality of Michael's reappearance, she couldn't help but question her choices. Had she been protecting Ethan, or had she been protecting herself? The memories came rushing back, unbidden. The early days after Michael left, when every step felt like a battle she had to fight alone. She remembered the nights she lay awake, terrified of what the future held, and the mornings when she forced herself to keep going for Ethan's sake. She had poured every ounce of her energy into building a stable life for her son, determined to prove that they didn't need anyone else. But now here they were, and Michael's presence had cracked the foundation she had worked so hard to build. A soft knock at the door startled her. For a moment, she thought it might be Ethan, but when she opened it, she found Michael standing there. His posture was hesitant, his expression a mixture of guilt and hope. "Emily," he said quietly, "can I come in?" She hesitated, every instinct screaming to slam the door in his face, but something in his eyes stopped her, against her better judgment. She stepped aside and allowed him to enter. Michael glanced around the room, his hands stuffed awkwardly into his pockets. "I don't want to bother you," he began, his voice careful, "but I needed to talk to you. Alone." Emily crossed her arms, leaning against the desk. "What could you possibly have to say that you didn't already say years ago?" He winced at her words but nodded as if he had expected them. "I deserve that. I know I do, but Emily, seeing you and Ethan, it brought back everything I tried to bury. I made a terrible mistake back then, and I've regretted it every day since." Her eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. "You regretted it. That's convenient. Meanwhile, I was raising a child on my own, working 3 jobs just to make sure he had what he needed. Don't talk to me about regret, Michael. I'm not trying to excuse what I did," he said quickly, his tone desperate. "I know I hurt you. I know I abandoned you both, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to make things right, even if it's too late for us." Emily's chest tightened at his words. Part of her wanted to lash out, to throw every ounce of pain and anger she felt back at him. But another part of her, a quieter, more vulnerable part, wanted to believe he was sincere. "Making things right," she echoed, her voice softer now. "How exactly do you plan to do that?" Michael took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. "I don't know yet, but I want to start by being there for Ethan, if he'll let me." Emily looked away, her gaze drifting to the city lights beyond the window. "Ethan's not a little boy anymore, Michael. He's a man, and he's done just fine without you." "I can see that," Michael said earnestly. "He's incredible, Emily, and that's because of you. You raised him to be strong, smart, and kind. I don't want to take credit for any of that. I want to know him, to be a part of his life, if there's still room for me." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Emily turned back to him, her expression guarded. "This isn't about what you want, Michael. It's about what's best for Ethan, and I'm not sure letting you back into his life is what's best." Michael nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand, and I'll respect whatever decision you and Ethan make, but please, Emily, give me a chance to prove I've changed." Emily studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the selfish, arrogant man she had known all those years ago. What she saw instead was a man who seemed genuinely broken, remorseful, and desperate to make amends. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but laced with warning. "If you hurt him again, Michael, if you so much as make him doubt his worth, I won't hesitate to cut you out of our lives for good. Do you understand me?" "I do," he said without hesitation. "Thank you, Emily. You don't know how much this means to me." As he turned to leave, Emily's gaze lingered on his retreating figure. She wanted to believe he was sincere, but the scars of the past were not so easily healed. Only time would tell if Michael's promises were worth anything. She closed the door behind him and leaned against it, her heart heavy with doubt and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of the conference venue, casting a warm glow over the bustling preparations. Ethan adjusted his tie for what felt like the 100th time, his nerves battling with the excitement bubbling inside him. Today was his moment, a chance to stand before a room full of influential minds and share his vision for change. Emily watched him from across the room, her heart swelling with pride. Despite the turbulence of the past days, she focused on Ethan's accomplishments and his unwavering determination. This was his time, and she wouldn't let anything overshadow it. Michael entered the venue discreetly, his presence barely noticeable among the crowd of attendees. He had spent the previous night replaying his conversation with Emily, her warnings echoing in his mind. He knew he had been given a fragile opportunity, and he was determined not to squander it. From his spot near the back, Michael watched Ethan take the stage. The young man's poise, confidence, and passion were magnetic, commanding the room with ease. As Ethan spoke about educational equity and the power of grassroots initiatives, Michael felt a pang of both pride and regret. This was his son, brilliant, driven, and everything he could have hoped for, and yet, he had no hand in shaping him. When Ethan finished his presentation, the audience erupted into applause. Emily joined in, her smile radiant as Ethan stepped down from the podium as he made his way toward her. She enveloped him in a warm hug. "You were amazing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't be prouder. Thanks." "Mom?" Ethan replied, his grin wide. "I think it went pretty well." Before they could continue their conversation, Michael approached cautiously, his hands tucked into his pockets. "That was incredible, Ethan. Truly, you've got a gift." Ethan's smile faltered, and he glanced at his mother before turning back to Michael. "Thanks," he said simply, his tone polite but distant. Michael hesitated, unsure how to bridge the gap between them. "I was wondering if we could talk, just the two of us." Emily's protective instincts flared, but she caught the pleading look in Michael's eyes. She turned to Ethan. "It's up to you," she said gently. Ethan studied Michael for a long moment before nodding. "All right, let's talk." They found a quiet corner of the venue, away from the commotion. Michael gestured for Ethan to sit, but the younger man remained standing, his arms crossed. "What do you want to say?" Ethan asked, his tone even but guarded. Michael took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting slightly. "First, I want to say that I'm sorry for everything, for not being there for you, for your mom, for all of it. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be honest with you about why I made the choices I did." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Okay, I'm listening." Michael's voice faltered as he began. "When your mom told me she was pregnant, I was terrified. I was young, selfish, and too caught up in my own ambitions to see what was truly important. My family pressured me, made me believe that having a child would ruin everything I had worked for. And I let them convince me. I let my fear convince me." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Walking away was the biggest mistake of my life. I thought I could bury the regret, but it's been with me every day since." Ethan's jaw tightened, his emotions a storm beneath the surface. "So what now? You show up out of nowhere and expect me to just forgive you?" "No," Michael said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect that. I just want a chance to get to know you, to be a part of your life. If you'll let me, and if you can't, I'll understand. But I need you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere this time." Ethan stared at him, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured. "You know, my mom is the strongest person I've ever met. She gave up everything to make sure I had a good life. She didn't need you, and neither did I. But now you're here, now. And I don't know what to do with that." Michael's shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. "I don't deserve your trust, Ethan, but I'm willing to earn it, however long it takes." Ethan considered his words carefully, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to walk away, to protect himself and his mother from further pain. But another part, a quieter, more curious part. Wanted to see where this might lead. "All right," he said finally, his tone cautious. "I'm not making any promises, but we can start with this. Talking." Michael's relief was palpable. "Thank you. That means more to me than I can say." Their conversation was interrupted by a voice over the intercom announcing the next session of the conference. Ethan glanced toward the main hall, then back at Michael. "I should go. My professor wants to debrief after the presentation." "Of course," Michael said quickly. "Go. And Ethan, thank you." As Ethan walked away, Michael felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile but real connection that he was determined to nurture. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that redemption might be possible. Emily watched from a distance as Michael returned to the crowd. She could see the effort etched into his face, the way he carried himself with a mix of determination and uncertainty. She didn't know if this fragile truce would last. But for Ethan's sake, she was willing to let it unfold. For now, the Atlanta air had a warmth to it. Even as fall approached, Michael had always thought of the South as a place steeped in tradition and resilience, but he had never taken the time to truly experience it. Now, standing outside the school where Emily worked, he felt like a trespasser in a world he barely understood, a world she had built without him. The building was modest but inviting, with vibrant murals painted by the students lining its brick walls. Children's laughter echoed from the playground nearby, a lively reminder of the life and energy Emily had surrounded herself with for years. Michael adjusted his tie, a habit born of boardroom settings, but it felt out of place here. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. Emily greeted him in the school's small office, her expression carefully neutral. She had reluctantly agreed to let him visit after his earnest pleas to understand more about her life and the sacrifices she had made. "This is where I've spent the last 20 years, she said, gesturing to the halls filled with student artwork and bulletin boards bursting with colorful announcements. "This is what matters to me." Michael nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "It's different from what I imagined." "And what did you imagine?" Emily asked. Crossing her arms, Michael hesitated, sensing the challenge in her tone. "I don't know. I guess I didn't think about it enough. That's part of the problem, isn't it?" Emily's gaze softened slightly but remained guarded. "Come on, let me show you around." They walked the halls together, passing classrooms filled with the hum of learning. Michael noted the way teachers greeted Emily warmly, their respect for her evident in their smiles and casual conversations. It was clear she was more than just a teacher here. She was a cornerstone of this community. In one classroom, a group of children worked diligently on a project. Emily stopped by the door, her presence immediately drawing their attention. "Ms. Carter!" one of the students called out, beaming. Emily stepped inside, kneeling to the child's level. "Hi, Marcus. What are you working on?" "We're making posters for the school fair," Marcus said proudly, holding up a piece of paper covered in bright, uneven letters. Emily laughed softly, her voice full of encouragement. "That looks amazing. I can't wait to see it at the fair." Michael watched from the doorway, his chest tightening. This was a side of Emily he had never truly known. Patient, nurturing, and deeply connected to the people around her. He realized just how much he had missed, not only in her life, but in the life he could have had with Ethan. When they returned to her office, Emily closed the door behind them, her expression unreadable. "So, what do you think?" "I think," Michael began slowly, "that you've built something incredible here. Something I can't even begin to take credit for." Emily sat behind her desk, her fingers lacing together. "I didn't build it for you to take credit, Michael. I built it because I had to. Because Ethan deserved better than the life we had in Washington." Michael nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, and I'll never be able to repay you for everything you've done for him, for both of you. But I want to support you now, in whatever way I can." Emily raised an eyebrow, skepticism flashing in her eyes. "Support me? What does that even mean, Michael? You think you can just write a check and make everything okay?" "No," Michael said firmly. "That's not what I'm saying. I know money can't fix what I broke, but maybe it can help with what you're building." Emily leaned back in her chair, considering his words. "This school doesn't need handouts, Michael. It needs people who care, people who are willing to show up and put in the work." "Then let me help," Michael said, his voice earnest. "Tell me what you need. Volunteers, supplies. I'll do whatever it takes." Emily studied him for a long moment, her defenses wavering. She had spent so many years resenting Michael, carrying the weight of his absence like a shield. But now, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, she wondered if letting him contribute might be a step toward healing, not just for him, but for herself and Ethan as well. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her tone measured. "But don't expect me to make this easy for you. You've got a lot to prove." "I understand," Michael replied, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the final school bell. Moments later, students flooded the halls, their chatter and laughter filling the air. Emily rose from her chair, her focus shifting back to her work as Michael followed her toward the exit. He couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for the world she had created. It wasn't flashy or glamorous, but it was real, built on hard work and love, and for the first time, he saw a glimpse of the woman she had become, a woman far stronger than the one he had left behind. Before he left, Michael turned to Emily. "Thank you for letting me see this. It means more than you know." Emily gave him a small, guarded smile. "Just don't mess it up, Michael, for Ethan's sake." As he walked to his car, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a long way to go, but this visit had shown him what was possible if he was willing to put in the effort. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The tension in the Carter household was palpable. It had been a few days since Michael's visit to Emily's school, and although he hadn't overstepped any boundaries, his reappearance had stirred emotions in both Emily and Ethan that neither were entirely ready to confront. Ethan sat at the small dining table, scrolling through his laptop as he reviewed notes from the conference. His mind, however, kept drifting back to Michael. Every interaction with him felt like a puzzle, one that Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to solve. There was an undeniable curiosity about the man who had contributed to his existence, yet remained absent for so long. Emily moved about the kitchen, preparing dinner with the kind of efficiency that came from years of balancing work and motherhood. She glanced at Ethan occasionally, sensing his distracted state. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, she set the wooden spoon down with a soft thud. "Ethan," she said. Her voice careful but firm. "We need to talk." Ethan looked up, his expression wary. "About what?" "About Michael," she replied, crossing her arms. "How are you feeling about all of this?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "I don't know, it's complicated," Emily sighed, sitting down across from him. "I know it is. Believe me, I understand better than anyone. But I need to know where your head is at. I need to know if you're okay." Ethan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I'm fine, Mom. It's just weird. You know, I spent my whole life thinking he was dead. And now here he is, trying to be a part of my life." Emily's chest tightened. She had worked so hard to shield Ethan from the pain of Michael's abandonment, and now she wondered if that had been a mistake. "You have every right to feel that way," she said softly, "and you don't owe him anything. Ethan, whatever you decide to do, I'll support you." He nodded, appreciating her words, but there was something unsaid hanging in the air. "I guess I just feel like I need to give him a chance. I'm not saying I trust him, but if he's trying to make amends, maybe I should let him." Emily's jaw tightened, a flash of pain crossing her face. "You're a better person than he deserves, Ethan. But if that's what you want, I won't stop you." Her words lingered, heavy with unspoken fears. Ethan noticed her expression and frowned. "Mom, are you mad at me for wanting to give him a chance?" "No," she said quickly, though her tone betrayed her inner conflict. "I'm not mad at you. I'm just worried. I've spent my whole life protecting you from him, and now I feel like I'm losing control of the one thing I've always been certain about." Ethan's brow furrowed. "You're not losing control, Mom. I'm not a kid anymore. I can handle this." "I know you can," she replied, her voice softening, "but that doesn't make it any easier for me." For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound coming from the faint sizzle of the pan on the stove. Finally, Ethan spoke, his tone gentle. "I get why you're worried, but I need to figure this out for myself. You've always taught me to face things head on, right?" Emily smiled faintly, a glimmer of pride breaking through her worry. "I did, and you're right. I just need to trust you." He reached across the table, taking her hand. You can, always. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Emily glanced at Ethan, her brow furrowing. Were you expecting someone? Ethan shook his head. No, you. No, she replied, rising from her chair. She crossed the room and opened the door, her expression shifting to surprise when she saw Michael standing there. Michael, she said, her tone neutral but edged with caution. What are you doing here? I'm sorry to show up unannounced, he said quickly. I wanted to drop this off. He held out a stack of books, each one carefully chosen with titles about education reform and community engagement. Emily hesitated before taking the books. You didn't have to do this. I know, he said, his voice earnest. But I wanted to. It's the least I can do. Ethan appeared behind her, his expression curious. What's going on? Michael offered a small smile. Just dropping off some books. Thought they might be useful for your projects. Ethan glanced at the titles and nodded. Thanks. That's thoughtful. Michael shifted awkwardly, sensing the tension in the room. I'll let you both get back to your evening. I just wanted to stop by. Before Emily could respond, Ethan spoke up. Wait, why don't you stay for dinner? Emily's eyes widened, her surprise mirrored by Michael. Ethan, she began, but he interrupted her gently. It's fine, Mom. I want to talk to him more. Michael hesitated, glancing at Emily for approval. She exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening, but eventually she stepped aside. All right, but don't expect this to be easy, Michael. I wouldn't dream of it, he replied. Stepping inside, as the three of them sat down to dinner, the atmosphere was tense but not hostile. Michael listened more than he spoke, carefully navigating the delicate dynamics between them. Emily remained guarded, but Ethan's curiosity led to cautious conversation. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. By the end of the evening, as Michael thanked them and left, Emily turned to Ethan with a mixture of resignation and hope. I hope you know what you're doing. Ethan smiled faintly. Me too, Mom. Me too. The following week passed in a blur of tentative progress and lingering tension. Ethan and Michael had begun meeting sporadically for coffee. Their conversations cautious but increasingly open. Michael listened intently as Ethan shared his passions and dreams, careful not to overstep. For Ethan, it was strange to speak so candidly with a man he barely knew, but something about Michael's demeanor made him feel safe. Emily, meanwhile, observed their growing bond with a mixture of apprehension and reluctant acceptance. She couldn't deny the sincerity in Michael's efforts, but a part of her still bristled at the idea of him stepping into their lives after so much time. She had spent years guarding Ethan's heart, and the thought of him being hurt now was almost too much to bear. One crisp afternoon, Michael invited Ethan to his hotel room under the pretense of reviewing some materials related to Ethan's education advocacy. Ethan arrived, his laptop in hand, and his mind preoccupied with his latest project. Michael greeted him with a warm but subdued smile, motioning for him to sit. I appreciate you coming, Michael said, his tone unusually somber. I wanted to talk to you about something important. Ethan raised an eyebrow, sensing the gravity of Michael's words. What's going on? Michael hesitated, the weight of the conversation ahead pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Ethan, there's something I need to tell you, and I want to be honest with you about why I've been trying so hard to reconnect. Ethan's posture stiffened slightly, his instincts bracing for impact. Okay, I'm listening. Michael's gaze dropped to the floor before meeting Ethan's eyes again. I've been diagnosed with a rare form of lymphoma. The doctors caught it late, and the prognosis isn't good. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and for a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. He stared at Michael, his mind scrambling to process the revelation. You're sick, he finally managed. His voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded. I've started treatment, but the odds aren't in my favor. That's why I came looking for you and your mom. I didn't want to leave this world without at least trying to make amends. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his emotions a swirling mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. So what? You're dying. And now you want us to forgive you? Is that it? No, Michael said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know the truth, and I wanted to use whatever time I have left to do something meaningful. For you. For your mom. For the people you care about. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. You think showing up now after all these years makes up for what you did? Do you have any idea what it was like growing up without a father? Watching my mom work herself to the bone just to make ends meet? Michael's face crumpled, the pain in Ethan's words cutting deep. I can't undo the past, Ethan. If I could, I would, but I can't. All I can do is try to be here now, for as long as I have left. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced the room, his mind racing. This is just a lot to process, he said finally, his voice strained. I don't even know how to feel about this. Michael nodded, his shoulders slumping. I understand, and I don't expect you to have all the answers right now. I just needed you to know. Ethan stopped pacing, his back to Michael as he stared out the window. The city below buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. After a long silence, he turned back to Michael, his expression unreadable. I need some time to think about this, he said, his tone flat. Of course, Michael replied, his voice soft. Take all the time you need. Ethan left the room shortly after, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. He had spent his whole life imagining what it might be like to meet his father, to confront the man who had abandoned him and his mother, but he had never imagined this, a man seeking redemption in the shadow of his own mortality. When Ethan returned home that evening, Emily immediately sensed that something was wrong. He walked through the door silently, his movements heavy with unspoken emotion. She approached him cautiously, her maternal instincts on high alert. Ethan, she said gently. What happened? He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Michael told me he's sick lymphoma, he said. It's bad. Emily's breath caught, her chest tightening. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The anger and resentment she had harbored for Michael for so many years clashed with the faint pang of sympathy his condition stirred. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice quiet but sincere. That must have been hard to hear. Ethan nodded, his hands stuffed into his pockets. Yeah, it was. They sat together in the living room, the silence between them both comforting and heavy. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice filled with uncertainty. I don't know what to do, Mom. Part of me wants to walk away and let him deal with the consequences of his choices. But another part of me feels guilty, like I'd be abandoning him, just like he abandoned us. Emily reached for his hand, her touch warm and steady. Whatever you decide, Ethan, it has to be what feels right for you. Not for him, not for me, just you. Ethan nodded, her words settling over him like a fragile layer of clarity. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for now, he took comfort in the knowledge that his mother was by his side. The autumn air was crisp as Ethan sat on a park bench, staring out at the lake. Leaves of amber and gold floated gently to the ground, and the distant sounds of children playing blended with the soft rustle of the trees. It was a serene backdrop, but his thoughts were anything but calm. The revelation of Michael's illness had left him reeling. He hadn't spoken to his father since their conversation at the hotel, nor had he fully processed what it meant. Michael's absence had shaped Ethan's life in ways he was only now beginning to grasp, and the idea of building a relationship with him felt both daunting and necessary. Ethan pulled out his phone and stared at Michael's number, his thumb hovering over the call button. After a moment of hesitation, he pressed it. The phone rang twice before Michael's voice answered, tentative but hopeful. Ethan. Hey, Ethan said, his tone measured. Are you free to meet? Michael's pause was brief but telling. Of course, where? Ethan glanced around the park. There's a coffee shop near the lake. I'll text you the address. I'll be there, Michael replied, his voice steady despite the undertone of urgency. An hour later, they sat across from each other in the quiet cafe. The atmosphere was warm, with the hum of soft conversation and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Ethan stirred his drink absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on the swirling foam. Michael broke the silence. Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you again. Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable. I needed time to think about everything. Michael nodded, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as though it were a lifeline. I understand, and I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying Michael. You said you wanted to make things right. What does that look like to you? Michael exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. It means being here for you in whatever way you'll allow. It means supporting you, not just with words, but with actions. I can't change the past. Ethan, but I want to do better with the time I have left. Ethan's jaw tightened, his emotions warring beneath the surface. It's hard to trust you, he admitted. I've spent my whole life without you, and now you're asking me to let you in, knowing there's a chance you won't even be here long enough to make it matter. Michael flinched at the bluntness of Ethan's words, but didn't shy away from them. You're right. I can't promise how much time I have, but I can promise that I'll use whatever time I do have to prove that I'm here for you, for both you and your mom. Ethan was silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to his coffee. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been if I hadn't tried. Michael's relief was palpable. That's all I'm asking for, Ethan. A chance. They spent the next hour talking, not about the past, but about the present. Ethan shared his ideas for his advocacy projects, his vision for improving education systems, and the challenges he faced along the way. Michael listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, and offering insights from his years in business. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was a start. Later that evening, Ethan returned home and found Emily in the living room, grading papers. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. How did it go? She asked. It was okay, Ethan replied, sinking into the chair across from her. We talked, he listened, it felt different. Emily set her pen down, leaning forward slightly. Different how? Like he actually cares, Ethan said, his tone cautious. I don't know, Mom. Maybe he really is trying. Emily studied him, her eyes searching for any sign of distress. And how do you feel about that? Ethan hesitated. Conflicted? I still don't trust him completely, but I also don't want to shut him out. Not if he's serious about making an effort. Emily nodded slowly, her expression softening. I can understand that, just be careful, Ethan. I don't want to see you get hurt. I know, he said, offering her a faint smile. Thanks, Mom. Over the next few weeks, Michael became a more consistent presence in their lives. He attended one of Ethan's presentations at the university, offering quiet encouragement and thoughtful feedback afterward. He also began volunteering at Emily's school, helping with administrative tasks, and even assisting in organizing a fundraiser for classroom supplies. For Emily, seeing Michael integrate into her world was surreal. There were moments when she caught glimpses of the man she had once loved, the charm, the intelligence, the ability to connect with people. But those moments were tempered by the scars of the past, and she remained cautious, her guard firmly in place. One evening, as they cleaned up after a school event, Michael approached Emily with a tentative smile. Thank you for letting me help with this. It felt good to be a part of something meaningful. Emily glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You've done well. The kids appreciate it. Michael hesitated, his voice softening. What about you? Do you appreciate it? Emily met his gaze, the weight of their history reflected in her eyes. I appreciate the effort, Michael, but trust takes time, and we're not there yet. Michael nodded, accepting her words without argument. I understand, I'll keep trying. As he walked away, Emily watched him go, a flicker of something indefinable stirring within her. She didn't know if Michael's efforts would ultimately lead to redemption, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that change, however small, might be possible. Ethan sat at his desk late into the night, surrounded by papers and the soft glow of his laptop screen. His latest project, a proposal for a pilot program to support underfunded schools, was consuming his thoughts. Every statistic, every case study, and every argument he crafted felt deeply personal. It wasn't just about education reform anymore. It was about making a difference in the lives of kids who might otherwise be forgotten. As he worked, a notification popped up on his phone. It was a text from Michael. I've been thinking about your project. I'd love to talk more about how I can support you. Let me know if you're free. Ethan hesitated. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of cautious conversations and tentative steps toward rebuilding a connection with his father. Despite his initial doubts, he couldn't deny that Michael's presence had started to feel less intrusive and more genuine. Slowly but surely, a fragile bond was forming. He typed a quick response. How about lunch tomorrow? Noon at Café Montrose. Michael's reply came almost immediately. I'll be there, looking forward to it. The next day, Ethan arrived at the cafe to find Michael already seated. A folder of documents spread out in front of him. He greeted Ethan with a warm smile, gesturing to the chair across from him. I've been reading up on education policy, Michael said, tapping the folder. You've inspired me to learn more about the challenges these schools are facing. Ethan raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. You've been doing homework, Michael chuckled. Something like that. I figure if I'm going to support your work, I should at least understand what I'm talking about. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying Michael. What do you mean by support? Michael's expression grew serious. I want to help fund your pilot program. I've already spoken to some contacts who could help with logistics, and I'm willing to provide the initial investment to get it off the ground. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. You'd do that, just like that. Michael nodded. Absolutely. I believe in what you're doing, Ethan. And more than that, I believe in you. For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to respond. He had spent so much of his life wondering what it would feel like to have his father's support. And now that it was being offered, it felt almost surreal. I don't know what to say, Ethan admitted. This could change everything. Michael smiled softly. Then let's make it happen. As their conversation continued, Ethan found himself opening up more than he had anticipated. He shared his frustrations about the systemic barriers in education, the resistance he faced from certain policymakers, and his fears about whether his work would truly make a difference. Michael listened intently, offering thoughtful insights and encouragement. You're doing something incredible, Michael said. And no matter how tough it gets, don't lose sight of why you started. The impact you're making is real, Ethan, even if it takes time to see the results. Ethan nodded, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. For the first time, he felt a sense of partnership with Michael, not as a father and son, but as two people working toward a common goal. Later that evening, Ethan shared the news with Emily. She was sitting on the couch, grading papers, when he walked in and dropped his bag on the floor. Mom, he began, his voice tinged with excitement. Michael wants to help fund the pilot program. Emily looked up, her expression cautious. He does. Yeah, Ethan said, sitting beside her. He's serious about it. He's already talked to some of his contacts, and he's willing to cover the initial costs. Emily's brow furrowed slightly. And how do you feel about that? Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. I feel conflicted. On one hand, I'm grateful. This program means everything to me, and his support could make it a reality. But on the other hand, I don't want to rely on him too much. I'm still trying to figure out where he fits in my life. Emily nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. It's a big step, Ethan, and I know how much this program means to you. Just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, not because you feel obligated to accept his help. I know, Ethan said, and I promise I'm being careful, but it feels good to have his support, like maybe he's trying to make up for lost time. Emily's heart ached at his words. She could see how much Ethan wanted to believe in Michael. And while she remained wary, she couldn't deny that Michael's actions had been genuine so far. Just remember, she said softly, this is your journey. Don't let anyone take that away from you. I won't, Ethan assured her, offering a small smile. Thanks, Mom, as the days turned into weeks. Michael's involvement in Ethan's project became more hands-on. He attended planning meetings, connected Ethan with influential figures in the business world, and even accompanied him to a school site visit. The two of them began to develop a rhythm, their interactions growing more natural with each passing day. For Ethan, the experience was transformative. He saw a side of Michael that he hadn't expected, a man who was determined, resourceful, and genuinely invested in making a difference. And while the scars of the past hadn't fully healed, they were beginning to fade, replaced by the tentative hope of what their relationship could become. The autumn days grew shorter, the crisp air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Emily sat on the porch of their small house, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. She watched the horizon, the colors of the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The quiet moments like this were her sanctuary, a time to reflect and process the whirlwind of changes in their lives. Ethan had just left for another planning meeting with Michael, their shared project, gaining momentum faster than anyone had anticipated. Emily had watched the two of them leave together, their conversation animated and filled with purpose. It was a sight that stirred conflicting emotions within her: pride for Ethan's accomplishments, relief that Michael seemed to be keeping his promises, and a lingering uncertainty that refused to let her fully trust him. She sighed, her gaze dropping to the steam rising from her cup. Forgiveness had never come easily to her. She had spent years building walls to protect herself and Ethan from the pain of Michael's absence. Letting those walls down now felt like a betrayal of the woman she had been, the woman who had fought tooth and nail to create a life for her son without him. But there was something else, a quiet voice inside her, growing louder with each passing day, that whispered about the weight of carrying resentment. It wasn't just Michael who had suffered under the burden of his mistakes. She had too. The anger, the hurt, the bitterness. They had been her constant companions for so long that she hadn't realized how heavy they were. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke her reverie. Emily looked up to see Michael stepping out, his expression hesitant but determined. He approached the porch slowly, as if testing her reaction. "Evening, Emily," he said, his tone careful. "Michael," she replied, her voice neutral. "What brings you here?" He gestured toward the chair next to her. "Do you mind if I sit?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." Michael settled into the chair, his hands resting on his knees. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "I wanted to talk to you," Michael began finally, his voice quiet. "About us. About everything." Emily raised an eyebrow, her expression guarded. "That's a broad topic." Michael chuckled softly, though there was little humor in it. "I know, but I've been thinking a lot lately. About the past, about what I did and about what I missed. And I want you to know how sorry I am." Emily's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, letting him continue. "I can't imagine what it was like for you," Michael said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Raising Ethan on your own, building the life you did without any help from me. I was a coward, Emily. I ran because I was scared and selfish. And I've regretted it every day since." His voice broke slightly, and he took a deep breath before continuing. "I know I can't change what I did, but I want to make amends. Not just for Ethan, but for you too. You deserved better than what I gave you." Emily's throat tightened, her grip on her mug loosening slightly. She looked at Michael, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was raw emotion. "It's not that simple, Michael," she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "You left us. You made your choice, and we had to live with the consequences. I had to be strong for Ethan because I didn't have another option." "I know," Michael said softly, "and I admire you more than I can put into words, but carrying all that alone, it must have been so heavy." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. "It was, but I didn't have the luxury of falling apart." The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice quieter now. "Do you really think you can make up for all those years, Michael?" Michael met her gaze, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try, for as long as I have left." Emily looked away, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb, but she couldn't ignore the change she saw in him. He wasn't the same man who had left her at Union Station all those years ago. The arrogance and selfishness she had once despised had been replaced by humility and a genuine desire to make things right. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I also don't know if I want to carry this anger forever." Michael nodded, his expression softening. "That's all I can ask for. A chance to show you that I'm not the man I used to be." They sat in silence for a while longer, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting the world in shades of deep blue. The air between them was still heavy, but for the first time, it felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge, fragile but real. As Michael rose to leave, he turned to her with a tentative smile. "Thank you for letting me talk. It means a lot." Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "Good night, Michael." "Good night." Emily, as he walked back to his car, Emily watched him go, her thoughts swirling. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily, and the scars of the past wouldn't vanish overnight. But as she sat alone on the porch, the weight of her anger felt just a little bit lighter. The first signs of winter had begun to creep into the air. The leaves that once blazed with color now blanketed the ground, and the sharp chill carried the promise of snow. Ethan stood by the hospital window, staring out at the city skyline, his mind heavy with the reality he had been trying to avoid. Behind him, Michael lay in the hospital bed, his once commanding presence diminished, but his spirit still unwavering. The lymphoma had progressed faster than anyone expected. Despite the treatments, Michael's condition had worsened, and now he spent most of his days in the quiet confines of the hospital room. Ethan had taken to visiting him daily, often bringing updates about the pilot program they had worked on together. It was their shared project, a bond that had brought them closer in a way Ethan hadn't thought possible. "You're awfully quiet today," Michael said, his voice raspier than usual but still tinged with warmth. Ethan turned from the window, forcing a small smile. "Just thinking about the project?" Michael asked, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Or about how your old man keeps beating you at chess?" Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Neither. Just life, I guess." Michael's smile faded, replaced by a look of understanding. "It's okay to be scared, Ethan. I am too." The admission caught Ethan off guard. He sat down in the chair beside the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "How do you do it?" he asked quietly. "Face all of this with so much grace." Michael took a moment before answering, his gaze distant. "Because I finally have something worth fighting for. And because I know, no matter what happens, I've made peace with the choices I can't undo. Being here with you, seeing the man you've become, that's more than I deserve. But it's enough." Ethan's throat tightened, the weight of his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You didn't have to fight alone, you know," he said, his voice thick. "I would have been there. Mom would have been there." "I know," Michael said softly, "and that's my biggest regret. I didn't give you the chance to be there for me because I was too proud to admit I needed anyone. But you're stronger than I ever was, Ethan. Don't make the same mistake." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the machines filling the room. Ethan's mind swirled with memories, both old and new, of the father he was just beginning to know. Later that evening, Emily arrived. She stepped into the room with her usual quiet grace, carrying a small bouquet of winter flowers. Her eyes met Ethan's briefly before shifting to Michael, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to dissipate. "Michael," she said, setting the flowers on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" Michael managed a faint smile. "Better now that you're here." Emily's lips quirked into a small smile, though her eyes betrayed the emotion she worked so hard to contain. She pulled up a chair beside Ethan, her presence a steadying force in the room. The three of them spent the evening reminiscing about Ethan's childhood, about Emily's work at the school, and even about Michael's early days in business. The conversation was light, peppered with laughter and the occasional poignant silence. It was a moment none of them had expected to share, but one they cherished nonetheless. As the night wore on, Michael's energy waned, his voice grew softer, and his eyelids grew heavy. Emily noticed first, reaching out to touch his hand. "You should rest," she said gently. Michael nodded, his gaze shifting between Emily and Ethan. "Thank you. For everything. Both of you." Ethan swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "We're here, Dad. We're not going anywhere." Michael's eyes softened at the word, Dad, a title he had spent so long running from. He reached for Ethan's hand, gripping it weakly but firmly. "You're going to do amazing things, Ethan, and I'll be watching every step of the way." Tears pricked the corners of Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them away, squeezing Michael's hand in return. "I'll make you proud." Michael turned to Emily, his expression filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Emily, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you know how much I admire you. You've been the rock of this family, even when I wasn't there." Emily's composure faltered for a moment, and she nodded, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've made your peace, Michael. That's what matters now." Michael closed his eyes, a look of contentment settling over his face. "I love you both," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for giving me this chance." The room fell into a profound silence, the kind that carries both sorrow and gratitude. Ethan and Emily sat by his side, their hands resting on his, as Michael drifted into a peaceful sleep. When the morning came, Michael was gone. Ethan and Emily sat in the quiet stillness of the room, their grief heavy but not unbearable. There was a sense of closure, a bittersweet peace that came from knowing Michael had found redemption in his final days. As they left the hospital together, Emily placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He was proud of you," she said softly. "And so am I." Ethan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "He was proud of you too, Mom." More than he ever said. They stepped out into the cold morning air, the weight of loss mingling with the warmth of healing. Together they walked forward, carrying Michael's memory and the lessons he had left behind. The weeks after Michael's passing were a blur of quiet reflection and steady progress. Ethan and Emily carried on, their lives forever changed by the man who had re-entered their world so briefly, yet left such a profound impact. Though the grief lingered, it was softened by the memories of reconciliation and the knowledge that Michael had found peace in his final days. Ethan sat at his desk, poring over the final details of the pilot program proposal. The initiative, now officially named the Johnson Education Fund, was set to launch in partnership with local schools, thanks to the foundation Michael had established before his death. It was a fitting tribute to a man who had sought redemption through meaningful action. Emily entered the room, a tray of tea in her hands. She placed it on the table beside Ethan, her eyes glancing over the papers strewn across his desk. "How's it coming along?" she asked, her tone warm. Ethan looked up, a faint smile on his face. "Almost there. I'm just finalizing the rollout schedule. It feels surreal, like it's finally happening." "It's happening because of you," Emily said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "This is your vision, Ethan. Your hard work. And his support," Ethan added quietly. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "It's strange, Mom. I spent so much of my life not knowing him. And now, it feels like he's everywhere. In this program, in the people we're helping. It's like he's still here." Emily's chest tightened at his words, the familiar ache of grief surfacing. "He is," she said softly, "not in the way we want, but in the ways that matter." The two of them shared a quiet moment, their bond strengthened by the journey they had navigated together. Though the scars of the past remained, they had become a part of their story, a reminder of their resilience and the power of forgiveness. A few days later, Ethan stood at the podium of a packed auditorium, the first official event for the Johnson Education Fund. Educators, community leaders, and families filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and hope. Ethan took a deep breath, his nerves steadied by the knowledge that this moment was bigger than him. "Good evening," he began, his voice clear and confident. "Tonight marks the beginning of something extraordinary. The Johnson Education Fund was born out of a simple but powerful idea that every child deserves access to quality education, no matter their circumstances." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "This fund is named for my father, Michael Johnson, a man whose life taught me that it's never too late to make a difference. He believed in this mission, and his support made it possible for us to be here today. But this isn't just about him. It's about all of us. It's about the communities we're building and the futures we're shaping together." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the room with an energy that brought tears to Ethan's eyes. He stepped back from the podium, catching Emily's proud smile from the front row. She nodded at him, her eyes shining with both pride and emotion. After the event, Ethan and Emily stood outside the auditorium, the cold night air biting at their cheeks. They watched as attendees filtered out, their conversations buzzing with excitement and optimism. "You were incredible up there," Emily said, her voice filled with pride. "Thanks, Mom," Ethan replied, his smile genuine. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Emily shook her head. "You've always had the strength and vision, Ethan. I just gave you the tools. The rest was all you." Ethan glanced up at the star-filled sky, his thoughts turning to Michael. "Do you think he'd be proud?" Emily followed his gaze, her expression softening. "I know he would. He didn't just see what you've accomplished, Ethan. He saw who you are, and that's what mattered most to him." Ethan nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. a letter Michael had written before his passing. Ethan had read it countless times, but tonight, its words felt especially poignant. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer by your side, but I want you to know that you've given me more than I ever deserved. Your strength, your kindness, your determination. They are a testament to the incredible person you are and to the extraordinary woman who raised you. Carry this mission forward, not just for me, but for every child who needs someone to believe in them. I'm so proud of you, Ethan. Always. Love, Dad. Ethan folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into his pocket. He turned to Emily, his voice steady. I'm ready, Mom. Ready to carry this forward. Emily smiled, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. And I'll be right here with you, every step of the way. Together they walked into the night, their path illuminated by the legacy Michael had left behind, and the future they were building, one rooted in hope, resilience, and the power of redemption.